One world currency.
The New World Order.
Those are the roots of trouble.
I imagine that right now you're feeling a bit like Alice, tumbling down the rabbit hole. Let me tell you why you're here. You're here because you know something. What you know you can't explain, but you feel it. You felt it your entire life. That there's something wrong with the world. You don't know what it is, but it's there, like a splinter in your mind, driving you mad. It is this feeling that has brought you to me. This is your last chance. After this, there is no turning back. You take the blue pill, the story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. All I'm offering is the truth, nothing more.
For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence, on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of elections, on intimidation instead of free choice, on guerrillas by night instead of armies by day. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations. Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. No expenditure is questioned, no rumor is printed, no secret is revealed. But I am asking your help in the tremendous task of informing and alerting the American people.
And now, welcome to another episode of Down the Rabbit Hole. Here's your host from federaljack.com. It's Popeye.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to tonight's live edition. It is Monday, October 8th, 2012. Tonight, I'm going to get into a little bit of a history lesson. You're going to hear some audio from a movie that continuously gets removed from YouTube. And it's actually gotten me copyright strikes before on one of my older accounts. It's not up as far as I know, and I've tried to find it in full length on YouTube any longer. There is a version that's broken up into some parts, and I think the way the guy was able to get it up is, I think some of the stuff, because it's the way it's broken up, I think he was able to avoid some of the copyright garbage. But this movie was not put together by an American film company. It was put together by a Middle Eastern film company, not really a film company. I should rephrase that. It was put together by an independent journalist who put this documentary together. And through whatever sources in the Middle East, and it wasn't some, United Arab Emirates film or Saudi film, because this thing exposes what really happened in the first Gulf War. Something that you will not hear here in the United States. The audio that you're going to hear tonight is going to force you to face reality. And if you have a different narrative of the first Gulf War, after tonight you'll understand a little bit more in detail about what happened. Before we get into it, I want to give a big shout out over to Chris Gio and Cherie Gio over at Truth Frequency. They've created their own network over the past year. Chris and Cherie have been working on it, and they've gotten all the bugs worked out of it, and they're launching Truth Frequency Radio. It's truthfrequencyradio.com. And I want to give them a big shout out and a big thank you because they syndicate my broadcast every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and Sunday. So thanks, Chris. Thanks, Cherie. I appreciate you guys syndicating my broadcast and putting it on your stream for your listeners. And that's pretty awesome. That's how we're supposed to do it here in the alternative media. We're supposed to show the mainstream douchebags up. We're supposed to build bridges. We're not supposed to infight and snipe each other and, oh, he's a schmuck or this guy, whatever. If you don't like somebody that's out there, and trust me, there are people that I don't like. By now, many of you people know some of them. And it's not really by my word of mouth. It's just I don't talk about certain people, and there's no need to. The infighting thing is retarded. I think it gives the powers that shouldn't be ammo, rather, to use against us. And it gives the mainstream media ammo to use against us and say to people like, look, they're a bunch of children infighting. They don't talk about serious issues. They're a bunch of conspiratards. We can't give these people ammunition to use against us. So I don't want to get off on too much of a tangent, but thank you, Chris. Thank you, Cherie. I appreciate you guys syndicating my radio show. All right, let's get into the hidden history of the first Gulf War. And I promise you, if you pay attention and you listen to what's being said to you, you will hear a much different narrative than that you have been taught in school or by the mainstream media or what you were even taught in the military if you're prior service. Take a listen.
At 2 a.m. local time, Iraqi troops crossed the eastern border of Kuwait.
Iraq has moved into Kuwait with more than 100,000 troops.
President Saddam Hussein commands over 1 million combat-tested troops, thousands of tanks.
On August the 2nd, 1990, Saddam Hussein's forces crossed the border into Kuwait, triggering the largest international crisis since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Coalition force led by the United States is assembled and then launches a massive air assault against Iraq before finally starting the largest ground offensive ever since World War II in the name of liberating Kuwait. On February the 28th, 1991, having fulfilled its mission, the international coalition abruptly stops the war against Iraq. The last Iraqi troops are evicted from Kuwait or taken prisoners. Victory is total. However, a decade after it was imposed to force Saddam out of Kuwait, the embargo over Iraq is still in place.
That assault had absolutely nothing to do with freedom and democracy.
You had to keep the image of the good guys.
So the press was kept out.
It is Israel, and Iraq fell in it.
The U.S. wanted that war.
The mosquitoes and flies put up a bigger fight than they did.
A large portion of Saddam's army never came into Kuwait.
They did not see tank tracks in the sand in the desert.
There was no war. Iraq was defenseless.
This is genocide, period.
Very naive that somehow sanctions would lead to the removal of Saddam Hussein.
The embargo strengthened the regime of Saddam Hussein.
The CIA actually supported Saddam Hussein and his Ba'ath Party.
Perhaps they have other secret intentions which I am not aware of.
If in fact the government lied, does that surprise anyone?
To understand why this embargo still stands and why the Gulf War happened in the first place, it is necessary to look at the history of Western involvement in the Middle East. In the 1920s, European and American oil companies discover and begin to exploit the first oil fields in the Middle East. The potential of these fields would become particularly critical to oil-poor Western Europe. The profit margins are huge, while the cut to local regimes is minimal, and the price of oil at the well is almost the same as mineral water. World War II changes this equation. Despite their victory over Nazi Germany, both France and England are gravely debilitated and begin losing their grip over their former colonies. In the Middle East, new leaders come to power, removing monarchies no longer protected by the former colonial forces and swept away by popular revolutions. However, the British and French role in the Middle East is now being taken over by the big winner of the war, the United States of America. Despite its own oil resources, the U.S. comes to realize the strategic importance of the Middle East oil. To contain the Soviet Union, to rebuild Western Europe, and to confirm the American industrial boom. but Washington hopes to maintain the inexpensive Middle East oil bonanza of before World War II. The new Middle East regimes think otherwise, and when they seek to retake control of their own national wealth, it strikes a chord of panic in Washington, London, and Paris. It is war against Egypt when Nasser seizes the Suez Canal. In Iran, Mossadegh nationalizes oil fields and kicks the British oil companies out. He is subsequently ousted by a CIA-orchestrated coup that puts the Shah back in command. In Iraq, as General Abdel Karim Qassem takes over and nationalizes the oil fields, the West cries, communism.
Saddam came to power in 1968. This coup came as a result of an oil deal between Iraq and French company Iraq. This contract upset the West in general and the Americans in particular, so they encouraged a coup in Iraq at that time.
The United States has had sort of a love-hate relationship with Saddam Hussein, which is not something that a lot of people in this country are aware of. Going back to the late 50s and early 60s, when the CIA actually supported Saddam Hussein and his Ba'ath Party in the coup that brought him to power.
The vice prime minister, a Ba'athist called As-Sadi, said in a book which he published in Beirut that we, the Ba'athists, came to power in an American train. He said that.
Despite his already well-known ruthlessness, Saddam Hussein remains the good guy of the West until 1972. This year, the OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, agrees to raise the price of the barrel from $3 to $22. Iraq follows suit and nationalizes its oil fields. Saddam is then deemed unreliable by Washington, and as a result, branded a terrorist leader. The U.S. then shifts all of its support to its long-standing ally in the region, the Shah of Iran.
For 25 years, from 1953, the Shah...
And this is Ramsey Clark, former U.S. Attorney General. I'm sure many of you know who he is.
Iran was the U.S. surrogate in the Persian Gulf and Middle East region. The U.S. sold him about $22 billion in arms from 1972 to 1976. The Shah was our man.
The hope of control by the West of the Middle East fades in 1979 when the Shah is overthrown by anti-Western fundamentalist leader Ayatollah Khomeini. By then, Saddam Hussein becomes again a viable card in Washington's hand. He becomes the actual president of Iraq after 11 years of being its vice president, and then perpetrates a sweeping purge of his opponents and attacks Iran without provocation or apparent reason.
The Stockholm Peace Research Institute has found that 52 different countries supplied weapons to Iran or Iraq, and 29 countries supplied both sides. So the very same countries that were saying how horrible the war was were using that war to stimulate their arms industries, to test some of their new weapons designs.
We did have some very limited engagement with the government of Iraq, actually a lot less so than other governments, and both protagonists were under arms embargoes during that period, arms embargoes that the United States, for its part, did not violate.
That's a lie, and of course that's a government official from the U.S. State Department, so you think you're going to get the truth there? Pfft, good luck with that.
The United States was perhaps the most hypocritical of the countries that supplied arms to the war, because its public position was, we're not going to arm Iran, we're not going to arm Iraq, when quietly, secretly, they were actually arming both sides of the conflict.
Saddam Hussein's ambition, however, is to develop Iraq's own non-conventional mass destruction weapons. An inquiry conducted by the U.S. Congress in 1992 reveals the American contribution to this effort is quite significant as well.
Chemical weapons, biological weapons. So, nerve gas, biological agents like sarin. The weapons of mass destruction that we had to go in and invade Iraq for. Remember those? Yeah. Who do you think sold him the weapons of mass destruction?
By the CIA and the U.S. State Department, whose reports as early as the late 70s have been detailing the extent of Iraq's mass destruction weapon programs and its repetitive use of chemical weapons against Iranian troops and Kurdish opponents.
In 1988, we had no idea that Saddam Hussein would be using chemical weapons on his own people. If we had known all this in advance, well, we would have made our policy quite a bit different in 1988, I'm sure.
Lying State Department spokesperson again.
Voices start being heard within the U.S. government asking about the wisdom of giving Iraq huge credits intended for purchasing U.S. agricultural goods, but used instead to buy helicopters, armored trucks, unreasonable amounts of pesticides, germs, and advanced arms-making technologies. The U.S. State Department and the White House under Presidents Reagan and then Bush systematically quell all the inquiry attempts from Congress and the Treasury Department. From massive arms purchases to the development of costly military research programs, Saddam Hussein has ruined formerly rich Iraq. By the end of his war against Iran in 1988, the country is in the red for $40 billion. It is precisely at this time, starting in 1988, when Iraq is most desperate to maximize its oil income, that yet another crisis begins unfolding.
OPEC keeps the price of oil stable by limiting how much oil each OPEC member country can produce. In 1989, after the end of the Iraq-Iran war, Kuwait suddenly exceeds its quotas by 20%, driving the price of oil down on the world market. As a result of Kuwait's production hike, Iraq lost almost 1/3 of its oil income. And this was at a time when Iraq was desperate for money. So the Iraqis felt that Kuwait was stabbing them in the back.
And not only that, but they were slant drilling underneath the dividing line between Iraq and Kuwait, the Kuwaitis, and they were slant drilling underneath the border and drilling into Iraqi oil wells, but they would be physically on their land, but slant drilling sideways into the wells. Of course, Saddam and the Iraqi government made these claims, and there is evidence to back it up, but the Western media and everybody said, "Oh, that's just crazy talk."
Welcomed by the West, this move by Kuwait hurts both Iraq's economy and pride, as they remember that Kuwait used to be part of their country before it was carved off by the British in 1928. Over the following months, tension escalates to the point of Saddam Hussein publicly threatening Kuwait. Given that Kuwait remains one of the primary oil suppliers to the West, the official response of the U.S. State Department to Saddam's saber-rattling is rather surprising.
There are no special defense or security commitments to Kuwait.
Yeah. That's 6 days prior to the invasion of Kuwait by the Iraq government and the military, the Iraqi military, and Saddam Hussein. 6 days before, that was our ambassador. If I remember correctly, it's April Gillespie. I could be wrong, but I think that's her name. She sat there and said that basically, Kuwait isn't a security problem for us. It's not a concern. Go ahead and do what you're going to do. Now, why would you publicly state that? That gives the message to Saddam, the U.S. isn't going to do anything. And then as soon as they go in, you get George H.W. Bush Sr., the eviler of the two, because the younger one's just a puppet. His father's really the evil jagoff. And Captain Evil is up there, and he's, well, we have to go protect the Kuwaitis and kill innocent people.
Americans had given indirectly an encouragement to Saddam Hussein to invade Kuwait.
If the Middle East stability is indeed a desirable goal for all, why did the West fuel such a brutal dictator as Saddam Hussein with credits, weapons, and advanced technologies? And why would the U.S. State Department repeatedly tell Saddam that it has no defense agreement with Kuwait?
You know, it should come as no surprise that at the end of one war...
This is the douchebag State Department employee.
And to reduce the threat that we saw in this region from the consequences of that conflict, that we would seek to direct either party in a more productive way, including Iraq.
I do not say...
This is the former Jordanian foreign minister.
...that what Iraq committed in invasion of Kuwait is something that is acceptable to any of the Arab countries. No, it is not. But the way and the attitude that preceded the crisis made everyone feel that there must have been other plans to entrap Iraq into this situation. It is a trap. Unfortunately, Iraq fell in it.
You hear what he just said? It was a trap, and Iraq fell into it. It was Saddam Hussein falling into this trap that the neocons that were in power, and of course, let's remember that they don't run things, they're just puppets. Somebody's got their hand up their asses as well, so let's not just think that the blame stops at the neoconservative party. But nonetheless, Bush Sr. and his cronies, Project for a New American Century douchebags, they were all in the Bush Sr. administration too. Same crew. They baited Saddam Hussein into invading Kuwait. That doesn't seem like history I've been taught or told. More truth when we come back, ladies and gentlemen. Don't go anywhere. Throw out your school history books. They're full of lies. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we are back. Let's get right into it. Picking up where we left off. The Hidden Wars of Desert Storm.
On August the 2nd, 1990, convinced the U.S. government would not interfere, Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait. While U.S. officials publicly express shock and surprise, the Pentagon is ready for action, having rehearsed this very situation for several months prior to Iraq's attack on Kuwait.
Oh, how convenient.
Wait.
We went ahead and did an exercise, what's called a command post exercise, which is what internal look was, to test our ability to deal with this particular scenario and also to uncover any command and control problems that might exist, any doctrine problems that might exist between the Air Force and the Navy and the Army forces. And it just so happened that we were in the middle of conducting the internal look command post exercise at the same time that the crisis developed in the Gulf.
Oh, yeah, Schwarzkopf. It just so happened. Coincidence. Just so happened that you guys were doing a drill for the exact thing that occurred. Where have I heard that before? Doing drills, and then the scenario where the drill is actually takes place. Where have I? That sounds vaguely familiar. In fact, that sounds vaguely familiar on multiple occasions. 9/11, 7/7, the first Gulf War. Weren't there invasion plans for Afghanistan signed by Bush the day before 9/11? What, wasn't FEMA in New York on September 10th for a drill? They just happened to be there. Oh, those planes. Those planes on 9/11. The military planes, the ones that were supposed to protect the skies. Yeah, they couldn't because they were out on drills that simulated planes being hijacked.
Prior to that, when I was doing my training, all the officers was telling us about
This guy's a Gulf War vet Marine, by the way.
The build-up, the thing with Iraqi possibly going through Kuwait and attacking Kuwait, and they told us to be prepared for it because it's very serious. And they said that they've been knowing this for about 2 years prior to this, you know. So a lot of this stuff was already going on. They knew that they were probably gonna, you know, and they were preparing us to go over to Desert Storm.
Hardly a few hours after Saddam's invasion, all Iraqi assets in the U.S. are frozen, and the U.S. Navy starts enforcing a blockade of the Iraqi coast even before the UN gets a chance to convene.
Wait a minute, you mean the United States was actually doing something supposedly under, you know, the UN, the banner of the UN, we're coming in to save you. But the Navy was already prepared to blockade before the UN was able to convene? Pre-planning? Oh, no, I'm a conspiracy theorist. I should not think that there would be any pre-planning for anything like an invasion or a war.
A couple of days later, delegations from the U.S. Departments of State and Defense fly to Riyadh to try to convince the Saudi government that the Iraqi troops are indeed threatening their borders. The official press release mentions showing the Saudis' satellite picture evidence of the Iraqi buildup at the Saudi border.
The Defense Department never made public any photographs that proved their point, and I doubt that they exist.
In January 1991, the St. Petersburg Times, along with ABC, runs a story based on commercial satellite pictures that happen to have been taken over Kuwait and Saudi Arabia at the time of Saddam's invasion of Kuwait.
The airport in the Kuwaiti capital appeared to have been abandoned, which it wouldn't be. You think about it a minute. If you're trying to supply 250,000 troops, that takes a lot of food, a lot of camping equipment, a lot of fuel for the tanks. They did not see tank tracks in the sand in the desert, and they would not have worn away because satellite photos are still picking up images of sand tracks in the desert of northern Africa that were left during World War II. So I said, I happen to know the press secretary to the Secretary of Defense personally, and I asked him, look, you know me, we've known each other for a long time. Let me come into your office and look at some of the U.S. intelligence photos. Prove to me that I'm wrong. I don't need to take them out of the building. I don't need to copy them. Prove to me that we're wrong and we won't run the story. And he refused to do that. He refused to do it on a number of occasions. Everyone else who was familiar with this story and familiar with the satellite photographs has concluded that the administration lied to the Saudis, to the world, in order to get the invitation to come into the Middle East to protect the innocent. What does it say about the government? If, in fact, the government lied, does that surprise anyone?
If indeed the U.S. government misled the Saudis about the Iraqis threatening their borders, what was the purpose? Ever since World War II, the U.S. administration had been making countless efforts to convince the Saudis to allow the largely Christian U.S. troops into the Holy Land of Mecca, supposedly to protect Saudi Arabia, but namely to secure its vast oil fields. Ever since OPEC raised the price of oil in the early 70s, this concern has become even more acute, epitomized by State Secretary Henry Kissinger's famous statement, "Oil is too important to be left to the Arabs."
Well, you have to understand that there were principal focuses of the world of military commands. You had the focus of the European Command on the NATO situation. You had the focus of the Pacific Command, for instance, on the Pacific, the Atlantic Command on the battle in the Atlantic. But there were certain areas of the world that had no focus. The Middle East was one area. The problem was that no Arab country wanted a major U.S. military headquarters in their country.
In 1990, the Bush administration was trying to convince the Saudis that this threat from the Iraqis was real because we couldn't go in there. The Allies, the British, the French, the Americans, and the others, couldn't go in there without an invitation from the Saudis. The Saudis had to feel threatened in order to invite the Allies to come in for protection.
And remember, bin Laden offered the services of his little ragtag wannabe Cobra organization, Al-Qaeda, over there to protect the Saudis. They didn't want the Americans coming in. And then, of course, later on, when the CIA faked their little bin Laden videotapes, what did they say? They said that one of the excuses was because our troops had gone into Saudi Arabia. Well, this is the event that they're talking about. And it's more about oil than just oil, by the way, because the wars that they've staged once they got this foothold do not serve the oil companies. Just remember that. When people are like, oh, it's the oil companies, they're the ones that fund wars. War does not benefit the oil companies or the oil industry because it makes it very volatile and it makes things, I guess you could say, unsecure. And they don't need that type of environment. In order for them to make money, they need the oil to flow and people to be coming to work very happily and not pissed off and trying to blow things up or kill people. That generally doesn't help the oil companies. It does, however, help people that are trying to control the world. You know who they are.
On August the 7th, 1990, the Saudi government officially accepts the insisting protection offer from Washington. The very next day, the U.S. military steamroller starts flying in without even notifying Congress. Within a few months, over 500,000 American troops would be deployed in Saudi Arabia. After persuading the Saudis, the U.S. government now has to convince the American public and the world that the threat is real and that it justifies a gigantic U.S. military buildup in Saudi Arabia. Meanwhile, at the United Nations headquarters in New York, the pressure is on to find a diplomatic and peaceful solution to the crisis.
Nous privilégions la solution pacifique. That force does not have to be inevitable.
The issues at stake by peaceful means.
Indeed, a peaceful solution is the desire of us all.
War is already in the minds of others. UN Secretary General Perez de Cuellar himself flies to Baghdad and meets with Iraqi President Saddam Hussein. He fails, though, to convince him that the international threat will be real if he chooses to remain in Kuwait. His failure, however, doesn't meet only despair and frustration upon his return to New York.
Saddam Hussein had indicated a willingness to compromise, mediate, and withdraw his troops. Also, the Arab states were given a chance to negotiate, but they were given 48 hours, I believe, by President Bush. So in summary, I think the Americans did not want a diplomatic solution at that late stage. And I'm talking, after the invasion.
At the time of the U.S. effort to get council approval to go to war, Yemen voted against the use of force resolution. And no sooner had the ambassador from Yemen put down his hand after the vote than there was a U.S. representative at his side saying, "That will be the most expensive no vote you ever cast." And sure enough, 3 days later, the U.S. cut its entire aid budget to Yemen, the poorest country in the Arab world.
On November 29, 1990, driven by the U.S. delegation, the UN Secretary Council passes the war resolution with a deadline set for January the 15th. There would be no turning back at this point.
It was the U.S. itself that made the decision that the Gulf crisis, the crisis caused by Iraq's illegal invasion of Kuwait, would not be solved by diplomatic means, but only by military means. The U.S. wanted that war.
The very crisis which the U.S. sat back, and I should not, well, the U.S., by the way, when you hear the term U.S., that's referring to the corporation, not the country, but the corporation and the scumbags that run it. But they sat back, as you've already heard, they sat back and said, "Oh, we're not going to do anything. Go ahead, do whatever you want." And then afterwards, we can't handle this with diplomacy. We must go in there with tanks and bombs and bullets and rockets and kill everything.
Iraq and its leaders must be held liable for these crimes of abuse and destruction.
January the 17th, 1991, 3 a.m. Iraq time. Hell breaks loose on Baghdad. The formidable firepower of the coalition, amassed primarily by the United States over the past 5 months, reveals its awesome might. Televisions worldwide start showing images of a supposedly foolproof, high-precision campaign of so-called surgical bombings said to hit nothing but Iraqi military targets.
The military decided to keep the press out, so the press was kept out, and you didn't know what was going on.
Typically, the U.S. military claimed that its bombing of Iraq was pinpoint accurate. Nothing could be further from the truth. 110,000 aerial sorties, 88,500 tons of bombs, the equivalent of 7.5 Hiroshimas in 42 days. And you could see the indiscriminate nature of the bombing. Probably killed 150,000, maybe 200,000 people. There's no question from the evidence of the bombing. The United States deliberately planned the destruction of the economic support systems for the Iraqi population. Just take water. They knocked out reservoir dams, pumping stations for water pipelines, filtration plants to purify the water so you could drink it without getting sick. On food, they systematically attacked the food chain from one end of the country to the other. They knocked out all electric power within hours. They knocked out communications repeatedly, attacked generator stations and telephone exchange facilities. They knocked out transportation. They showed that you can destroy a country and deprive it of essential life support systems without ever setting foot on it through cruise missiles and aerial bombardment.
February the 23rd, 1991, the coalition ground forces start rolling in Kuwait. The Allied offensive gets fast and deep into Kuwait without encountering significant resistance. The Iraqi military Leviathan is nowhere in sight. And the troops still present in Kuwait are simply no match for the modern coalition forces.
When we got to Kuwait, we were expecting, this 5 million man army, this big monster. And when we got there, they were like chihuahuas. The mosquitoes and flies put up a bigger fight than they did.
We knew that our capability was much better than that.
These people were like regular Joes that, hey, somebody comes to your house and say, either fight the Americans or I'll kill your family. Of course, you're going to say, give me the gun. They had no other choice. These guys didn't even know how to shoot the weapons. They were in regular clothes, and you pick up AK-47s. It's filled with sand. It's just like, what is this?
By the end of February 1991, when the dust from the coalition ground offensive starts to settle, the big surprise is not finding the large Iraqi force previously reported by Washington.
In mid-September, the Bush administration was saying that there were 250,000 Iraqi troops and 1,500 tanks amassing at the Saudi border for a possible invasion. I'm not saying there were none there. The people fleeing Kuwait passed Iraqi soldiers. They passed quite a few Iraqi soldiers, so there were some there, just probably not a force of a size that would invade Saudi Arabia.
You have to remember that a very large portion of Saddam's army never came into Kuwait. Okay, he kept a large part of his army back along the borders with Iran and along and within the capital, his Republican Guard specifically.
On February the 28th, 1991, the other big surprise is the announcement of a ceasefire when the Allied forces were already pushing deep into Iraq.
We took Kuwait, all of Kuwait, in 24 hours, the Marines. The army went through southern Iraq and took that. And that was within the 24-hour period. And we stopped. you know, everybody was like, well, why didn't we get Saddam? You felt like you went over there and you did your job, but you didn't get to finish your job. It was just like, why stop?
The United States military could have moved straight to Baghdad in less than 24 hours. There was a political decision not to do it.
On February 26, 1991, 2 days prior to Washington declaring ceasefire, a new element had appeared in the Iraqi equation. Tired of 12 years of ruthless dictatorship, a great portion of the Iraqi population had started an uprising against the regime in Baghdad. The news was withheld from the media as the Bush administration didn't want to make it look like they would stop the war to spare Saddam Hussein's regime.
People began to demonstrate in the streets, carrying arms and destroying things. Bush at that moment began to think we have to stop the war. And that's how he surprised General Colin Powell on the 27th of February by telling him, let us stop the war now. And when he asked him, what do you mean by now? He said, now, at this moment. And he did that in spite of the objections of Schwarzkopf.
If we had been allowed to go on for 1 or 2 more days, that we would have totally destroyed the Iraqi forces and it would have been a battle of annihilation. I said, when they first called me from Washington and asked me what my plans were, I said we plan to continue the operation.
By early March 1991, the rebellion is starting to spread all across Iraq. The Bush administration's response is a surprising support of Saddam's regime.
And what happened, of course, in Safwan, the way that General Schwarzkopf gave a lot to the Iraqis on the 3rd of March, when they met at Safwan at the border with Kuwait, when he allowed them to use helicopters, even armed helicopters, I came to the conclusion that there was some kind of deal.
So I said, yes, you can fly your helicopters. Now, subsequently, helicopters were used to suppress the rebels up north.
The Americans would ceasefire, which was a very unexpected early ceasefire, in order to give the chance to the Iraqis, to allow the Iraqis to be able to eliminate the rebellion in the south. For the next 2 years, there was no real attempt to topple the Iraqi regime in Baghdad. And there was no American attack, although there was so many reasons. And President Bush threatened so many times to go back to war because Iraq is not supervising their promises in 687 UN resolution. But real fighting did not happen. Real war did not happen.
A decade later, the victory is much less clear-cut. The Iraqi forces are long gone from Kuwait, but the United Nations sanctioned embargo is still in place over Iraq. The toll on its ordinary citizens is staggering.
There has never been an international sanctions regime even close to as rigorous and as tightly imposed as the sanctions that have been imposed on Iraq.
Saddam Hussein is one thing, and what's happening to the Iraqi people is a different thing. The Iraqi people are starving. People are dying.
How many times have I talked about this?
Everyone.
How many times have I brought this up? Our sanctions were worse than anything he did to his own people. The sanctions that the U.S. pushed for the government of the U.S. and the UN for 10 years. Now remember, this was made before the second invasion of Iraq when we went back in 2003. We dumbed their people down. We destroyed the literacy. We destroyed the nutrition. Ladies and gentlemen, we are back with hour number 2 here on tonight's live edition of Down the Rabbit Hole. I am your host, Popeye, from federaljack.com. It is October 8th, 2012. It is the Monday edition. And tonight I have been playing audio for you from a documentary film called Hidden Wars of Desert Storm. One of the most deleted videos on YouTube I've ever had the pleasure of uploading and having ripped down multiple times. If you've heard anything in the past first hour of the broadcast, you'll understand why. So without wasting any more time, I want to get back into it, because if you thought the information that you've heard already was damning, just wait. There's more. The goal of me playing this is that if I take you down and we look at history, we sit and I take you down the path of wars past, and I show you the truth about what has happened, perhaps, just perhaps, you and whoever else hears this broadcast, the people that are listening live, people that listen to the archive, hear it on a rebroad, people that hear it on YouTube, the goal is that you will look at this situation that I'm presenting to you now, the information, and compare it to what you're being told right now about war on Syria, war on Iran. Compare the story of what you were told to the truth of the situation in 91. Remember the lies of Iraq and the lies of Afghanistan, because 9/11 was a lie, right? So remember the Iraq invasion was just a complete fabrication, lie upon lie upon lie upon lie. So if you remember those lies, and you remember, you sit and you've looked at the history you were taught about the first Gulf War, and you compare it to this, and then you look at what's going on now with the call for the war in Iran, hopefully, just hopefully, it'll make you think and go, you know what? Maybe war isn't such a good idea. Now, I know a lot of you already think that, but remember, I have new listeners every day. So hopefully this reaches somebody and they say, wow, this all looks like the same playbook. I wonder what the end game is then. I wonder what the goal is. If they keep doing these things, what would be the goal? That's what I want you to think about.
Every one of us has lost children or members of their families. Not one Iraqi can say that he have lost no one. Every one of us lost our beloved.
Back in 1990, economic sanctions were seen, I believe, as a good alternative.
And this is the former director of the Iraqi sanction program from the UN.
To military activity and force. Since then, however, they've been sustained now for, over 9 years. They have had an impact on the people of Iraq, which is, in the view of many of us, genocidal, in the sense that economic sanctions, on top of the damage done by the Americans and others in the Gulf War, has led to the death of possibly 1 or 1.5 million Iraqi people, and particularly children. So the maintenance of these economic sanctions breach the Geneva Conventions on Warfare, because, as we all know, civilians are not to be targeted in war nor in economic sanctions programs.
And keep in mind, this is before we invaded Iraq a second time. I said this when Dahlia Wasfi was on. We destroyed their literacy rate. We destroyed their health, their nutrition with these sanctions and with the bombing. And if you heard what they said in the first hour, they blew up electricity plants, water plants. What were we attacking the second time we invaded Iraq? The same things, infrastructure.
Our country deteriorated since 1990. Also the deficiency of the vaccinations, including the absence of basic things like toilet paper. This leads to outbreaks of many infectious diseases.
Running water causes major problems. This is known. That's why they blow up water treatment facilities.
I couldn't see any child suffer from the malnutrition in our country.
What the doctor just said, in case you missed it, was before the war, there weren't children suffering from malnutrition in the country. After the war and after the sanctions, hundreds of thousands. Well done, UN.
Adra Saleh, 6 years. Her weight corresponds to the age of 1 year or less because of the deficiency of protein.
A 6-year-old girl's body weight is that of a 1-year-old child because of the lack of protein needed for her to grow properly.
The 6-month-old infant suffers from the chronic diarrhea. He needs special formula of milk to stop the diarrhea. This medical milk is not available.
Yeah, and you know why the medical milk's not available? Because we blew up the damn factory and called it a weapons plant.
In 1991, the United Nations voted a resolution meant to ease the impact of sanctions on the Iraqi population.
The idea behind the Oil for Food program was simple. That is, Iraq could use a certain amount of its oil revenues for the purposes of taking care of the needs of the Iraqi people.
State Department scumbag again that you just heard. And go look up the Oil for Food program. It was a complete fraud. They were stealing the money left and right, and it wasn't the Iraqi people that were stealing the money. Go look at what really happened. Of course, that got swept under the rug.
When the thing started, there were some incidents that are, it's like black comedy, that are funny because one of the companies had a contract to supply eggs, and the contract was sent for approval, and it seems the American delegate, without even looking, put it on hold and asked for explanation about the end use of this product. And the answer came back, you know, you boil it and you eat it, or you fry it and you eat it. And these are eggs. This should give you an idea about how things are done.
So Oil for Food, in my view, where it has maintained a level of intake in terms of food, inadequate, although that certainly is, it has failed in terms of addressing the needs of the Iraqi people. And thus we've seen the maintenance of malnutrition, the death of infants in particular.
Since yesterday, we missed 2 babies because of shortage of oxygen supply due to no electrical power necessary to make the oxygen.
This baby will die at any time because there is no oxygen. But we choose that baby because his weight is higher than this. Chance of survival of that baby better than this baby.
I feel sad because I can't do anything. I can't help these patients.
We have no gripe or animus against the people of Iraq. Our problem is with its government.
This baby named Amal Salim, 1-year-old infant, and we diagnosed as pneumonia. She couldn't receive the proper treatment of antibiotic, and therefore the baby died. Especially, we have shortage of clavuran antibiotic. This patient needed.
What is it to the UN and to the Americans to impose sanctions on medicine? I mean, only crazy people would do this. I mean, this is medicine. What's multi-use? Are they going to make atomic bomb out of a few tablets of medicine here or there?
Let me make clear that the purpose of the Security Council resolutions was sanctions as their tool, was so that Iraq should not be a threat to peace and security again.
So what he's saying is, that was the State Department douche again, and what he's saying is the reason why in summary, what he said there was basically the reason why they blocked medicine and food was so that they could never become powerful enough to ever rise up and do anything. There would always be a slave state to the UN now, basically is what they did to Iraq. And what happened when we invaded it in 2003? They couldn't adequately defend themselves. Oh, look, Scott Ritter, former UN weapons inspector who was then accused of downloading or watching child pornography and thrown in jail. Let's see what he has to say.
Covered the bulk of what the Iraqis were able to produce in terms of chemical weapons, biological weapons, ballistic missiles, and nuclear weapons. The infrastructure that Iraq used to produce these weapons has largely been dismantled, destroyed, or under monitoring by the weapons inspectors. So we have a good idea of what should be left. It's not very much.
Despite that, the U.S. has consistently moved the goalposts and said it's not enough if they abide by the requirements regarding weapons of mass destruction. Instead of saying, if you abide by the requirements of the UN resolution, sanctions will be lifted, the U.S. message is, it doesn't matter whether you comply or not, we're not going to lift sanctions anyway.
When UNSCOM began, I believe it was a legitimate effort to track down and destroy dangerous weaponry. And in fact, the Atomic Energy Agency and others were just about ready to clear UNSCOM, their work, and agree that Iraq was clean. Then Richard Butler was appointed, and he reopened many of the issues that in fact had been closed, and seemed to bring a new element to the investigation, perhaps very much supported by Washington.
Unfortunately, the actions of its executive chairman, Richard Butler, in concert with the United States government, allowed UNSCOM to be manipulated in a way which was outside the guidelines set forth by its true boss, the Security Council. The United States and the United Kingdom used UNSCOM as a trigger for the initiation of military action. The United States and Great Britain used information gathered by weapons inspectors to provide targets for their bombing. This is an accepted fact. So UNSCOM as an organization has been discredited.
It's true that an inspection entity of that sort can be manipulated politically and give an excuse to the more aggressive member states for further military action. And in a sense, we have that every day, almost every day of the week, when UK and American planes are bombing Iraq.
The Americans are bombing what they call the Iraqi radars, which is not true. They are bombing infrastructure. They are bombing homes of people. They have even bombed a tent of Bedouins with their animals, with the whole family who are dead. Every single day there was a bombing of Iraq. But not one of the media have spoken about that.
Now, if you don't see it in the media abroad, it's because I think people are, and it's becoming a too small a story for it's not as interesting as before.
On the 17th of January 1993, Bush sent 42 missiles on that date. One of them hit a Rashid Hotel when I was there.
Germany. I'm a German journalist from Bild Zeitung. I think I'm the only one that was injured.
The air attacks that you referred to are defensive in nature. Since 1991, there has been a no-fly zone in the north of Iraq. This no-fly zone was imposed, I will recall for your audience, after the Iraqi regime forced the exodus of over 500,000 Kurdish inhabitants of northern Iraq. The UN passed Resolution 688. It said that this should not happen, and then a no-fly zone was imposed in the north.
There is no reference in any UN resolution to the establishment of no-fly zones in northern or southern Iraq. The US has imposed them, and with the British, kept them in place, and the result is that civilians in the north and in the south, whose lives ostensibly are to be protected by the establishment of those no-fly zones, are being killed not by Iraqi soldiers or Iraqi planes, but by American bombings that go off course. That's who is killing the Iraqi civilians now in the northern and southern no-fly zones. One of the very bitter lessons of these years of war, both economic war and military war against Iraq, is that for the United States government, and I think for most governments in the Security Council, humanitarian considerations are simply not enough to influence policy. We have, of course, the famous statement by Madeleine Albright in 1996 when she was asked about the deaths at that time of 500,000 Iraqi children that have died as the result of sanctions. And of course, she did not dispute the figure. She simply thought about it for a moment and then said, on balance, we think it's worth it.
The 60-minute show, entitled Punishing Saddam, where State Secretary Madeleine Albright made this insensitive remark, aired on May the 12th, 1996. It has since been censored by CBS under political pressure. If indeed the price is worth it, as Ms. Albright declared, again, who is paying that price? And what does it buy? Is it really an attempt to force Saddam out of power, as is being claimed by the United States administration?
Well, the Iraqi Liberation Act is an additional expression of our concern about the regime that's in charge in Baghdad. The United States believes that this situation involving Iraq would be immeasurably better were Saddam Hussein no longer the leader of Iraq. The act passed by Congress is designed to provide support and resources.
According to the Iraqi Liberation Act, they said that they are ready to give the Iraqi opposition non-lethal equipment. They are thinking about computers and mobiles and desks and so on, and I don't think that by mobiles and computers we will be able to remove Saddam Hussein from power.
In other parts of the world, Washington has never proved to come short of ideas and solid means to get rid of governments deemed hostile or worth removing.
In 1992, when we first established the INC, we were planning to have an uprising, national resistance against the regime.
This is, by the way, one of the Iraqi resistance people.
In April 1995, we started this uprising, the military operation of it, but the Americans refused again to support that uprising, and Saddam Hussein was able to crush it.
To this day, Saddam Hussein remains Washington's most convenient bogeyman, justifying the continuing pressure on Iraq and in the Gulf region in general.
There was a belief, I think, for many years that somehow sanctions would lead to the removal of Saddam Hussein. Very naive, because in fact, economic sanctions and their impact have made Saddam Hussein stronger.
Why the embargo strengthened the regime of Saddam Hussein? First, because the mere livelihood of people became dependent on the government. He controlled people through starving them. But more important is that the embargo created a new class living very comfortably attached to him. You see nobody getting 100 times as much as a doctor. Why? Because he is part of the security system. And therefore he should be fed well, he should be given good accommodation. He created a power base of people whose daily interests were tied to him, so that when he goes, they lose all these privileges.
Sanctions have sustained Saddam Hussein in power, and there are many of us worldwide who believe that is also a policy of the United States. Because of the Saddam Hussein threat, quote unquote, the Americans have sold arms on a massive scale to the Arab states, the Gulf, Israel, of course, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia.
After the Gulf War, U.S. arms manufacturers and the Pentagon took advantage of making new arms sales to the Middle East at the rate of about $1 billion a month.
The oil-producing countries in 1990 had hundreds of billions of dollars in reserve. Now they have maybe hundreds of billions in debt.
But Saddam also serves a more direct goal for the Pentagon.
The United States had to have a justification to remain in the area. It intended to maintain major military forces that could protect and control the natural resources of the region. It wasn't particularly welcome. The people of Saudi Arabia didn't really want U.S. troops on their soil. So Saddam was chosen to remain the devil that would justify the presence of the American angels in this region.
It justifies a foot in the door. Like I said yesterday on Sunday's broadcast, the camel's nose underneath the tent, NATO's foot underneath, underneath the tent, or NATO's foot in the door. I mean, if we don't stomp on it, well, this, quote-unquote, justified the U.S. presence in the region, just in case they wanted to invade Iraq. Oh, flash forward to 2003.
After the Gulf War, the buildup at places like King Khalid Military City, which was supposed to be temporary, has become sort of a bridge for a possible long-term U.S. military base in Saudi Arabia and in the Middle East. There's now thousands of U.S. troops regularly in Saudi Arabia. So, at least on a de facto basis, Saudi Arabia has become a military base for U.S. forces in the Middle East. Unless there's a change of regime, that base could well end up being permanent.
Proclaimed as a sweeping victory by almost all Western media, the Gulf War and the subsequent crisis with Iraq have indeed amounted to a superior victory for Washington. Paramount arms sales at a level never seen before. At last, huge permanent military bases in Saudi Arabia, resulting in a better control of the oil flow and a better leverage on its pricing. The great losers, on the other hand, are the Iraqi population, still under a Stalin-like dictatorship and slowly dying from starvation.
I'm going to pause it right there. Now, remember what I said. This was made before the second invasion. Not only did it serve as a foot in the door for, quote-unquote, control of the oil resources, it served as a foot in the door for much bigger, darker reasons, like world domination, breakup of the Middle East, a foothold to eventually go into Iran. We'll be right back.
But the losers, however, are not just distant populations of the Middle East. Some of the victims of the Gulf War have also turned out to be right amongst the presumable victors of the war.
In 1991, most Americans were very happy that the Gulf War apparently had ended. It was a quick, decisive victory, and hundreds of thousands of U.S. troops were returning home to parades. What happened a few months later was that thousands of veterans started to report medical problems, such as achy joints, memory problems. They kept falling ill, they were getting rashes, and there was no explanation.
Concerning the use of the type of weapons used by the Allies in the Gulf War, the first warning came from soldiers themselves, whether in Britain or in the US, when they started complaining of symptoms, and that was related to the Gulf War and to the use of the weapons. So it's obvious that it took so long until people took it seriously, because there was this conspiracy of silence.
The first response of the United States military and the United States government was to ignore it, to deny that there was any problem with the health status of American Gulf War veterans.
You had to keep the image of the good guys, namely the Allied, and the bad guy, who is Saddam. It's Saddam Hussein who would use chemical weapons and who would harm his own population and the world with this type of weapons. And it didn't look very nice to show that the Allies have been themselves using weapons that were harmful.
Yeah, out of over almost 700,000 troops that took part in the first Gulf War, almost 200,000 of them filed for disability. Wow. So it's like a third. But don't pay any attention to that. No, it's all in their heads. They're just crazy. It's PTSD. There's nothing wrong with them. As of 2000, I guess this was made in January 1st of 2000, but as of January 1st of 2000, almost 10,000 of the Gulf War veterans had died. Now fast forward to 2003. Gee, I wonder why. Vaccines, chemical weapons, depleted uranium weapons. Where have I heard that before?
1970s through the 1980s, the Pentagon, in complete secrecy, started experimenting with a new type of high-perforation shell made of the heaviest, hardest, most plentiful metal around, readily available without mining costs or efforts. A metal that just happened to be sitting there in the hands of the U.S. Department of Energy. Uranium waste.
The U.S. Department of Energy and other nations that are involved in the enrichment have tremendous amounts of this waste left over.
Doug Rocky.
And they needed to find a use for it.
Depleted uranium rounds reached combat for the first time during the Gulf War. These rounds pierce anything known to this day, penetrating the thickest armor plates like butter. The downside, they are radioactive, contain traces of plutonium, the most toxic metal on Earth, and their debris remain radioactive for about 4.5 billion years.
Depleted uranium is a very hazardous toxic waste. For example, depleted uranium settles in the bone, it settles in the lungs, it settles in the liver, in the kidney, and also in the muscle and testicles. This is an experiment upon rats. Depleted uranium also crosses from a mother through the placenta to a fetus. All this information is widely available. However, the Pentagon, in their overwhelming desire, their passion to use depleted uranium weapons, is trying to suppress this medical research about its high toxicity.
I could go through the early reports on this issue. You know, this is one from July 1990, where they say the most exposed individuals and soldiers who went to a battlefield after DU rounds are shot, saying that civilians and soldiers may suffer health effects from inhalation and ingestion of DU dust, and even saying that once people realize the health and environmental effects of this weapon, there may be a move to ban it. And this was July 1990. This is just 6 months or so before the war. So you have to wonder why no warnings were ever disseminated to any ground forces prior to the war, even just to say, stay away from the vehicles that have been hit. Don't go climbing on the equipment afterwards.
What the military didn't do was tell the soldiers that the ammunition used by our airplanes and our tanks during the Gulf War was made out of this highly toxic radioactive substance.
And because we didn't know about the radioactive waste being used as ammunition, people were just picking up things in the desert, whatever they could find as a war trophy. And I think that if they would have known, they would have never touched it.
More than 436,000 U.S. troops are confirmed to have entered into those areas of radioactive toxic waste. And sadly, some soldiers camped in areas contaminated by depleted uranium, radioactive toxic waste for up to 2 months without any idea, without any warning at all.
I just want to say something about the Iraqis too, that I've seen a lot of photos and talked to people who've been to Iraq, and I've also seen photos of Bedouins who go out in the desert and they go to the destroyed tanks, and I've seen photos of them literally digging in the sand next to these tanks to look for scrap metal, and they've been doing this for years, and they take the scrap metal that they can find and they go and they sell it so they can buy food. This is the situation in Iraq.
If we compare the mortalities, that is, the patients died because of cancer, in 1988 we have only 34 patients died because of cancer. But in 1998 we recorded 428 patients died because of cancer.
This is, by the way, in Basra General Hospital. Again, before we invaded and bombed the living shit out of Basra.
Cancer which affects elderly people. Now it's seen in younger age groups. I have a patient who have cancer of the ovary who is only 11 years old.
Makes you wonder if we bomb certain cities to cover things up. Makes one wonder, doesn't it? Killing kids, killing innocent women, killing anyone for no reason is wrong. Unless it's in self-defense, and I really mean self-defense. Time to own up to what we did. We all took part in it. Silent, obedient consent. I'll read you what one of the doctors in Basra Children's Hospital had to say. All of these children within the leukemia ward, they don't know their prognosis because all of them will die. Isn't that special? Depleted uranium. And remember, we used it again.
And death strike the children
We used it again. Don't forget that.
even before they are born. At the Children's Hospital, malformed babies happen at the frightening rate of 1 or 2 a day.
And now they do have the same problem in Fallujah.
Who's responsible today? At the highest levels where the United States made the decision to produce and use uranium-238, otherwise known as depleted uranium munitions in combat.
The Department of Energy is in charge of maintaining the stockpile of depleted uranium in this country, which we have about 1.5 billion pounds. Basically what they want to do is recycle it so that they don't have to hold it anymore. It's just going to go to defense industry to be used in the ammunition.
The Pentagon has good reasons to deny the toxicity of uranium waste and the contamination of both the local populations and the Allied forces.
They cannot admit that today many of us are sick, that Iraqis are sick. This is all about two things: liability and dollars to clean up the mess that was created around the world.
Medical tests and treatments have been delayed or denied to most Gulf War veterans in an effort to evade both moral responsibility and health care costs.
The Army spent 3 years trying to discharge me with no pension. They just kicked me out and didn't want to take responsibility for my medical conditions.
As shocking and disturbing as it is, this attitude from the Pentagon is nothing new.
The use of radioactive toxic waste, called depleted uranium, by the military is another sad chapter in a long and tortured history of the United States military.
Hey, kids, still think it's cool to go join up for the military? Because, look, this was before Afghanistan and Iraq, the Gulf War Part 2, right? This was back before the current wars. This was dating back to the first Gulf War. And they're having the veterans were having the same health issues that guys coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq are now having. So they knew. They lied to you. Kids, if there's anyone out there that's listening, that's thinking about joining the military, this ought to show you, don't do it.
During World War II and shortly afterward, hundreds of U.S. soldiers were told to stand outside and witness atomic bomb blasts. It wasn't until the 1990s that many of these veterans stepped forward and demanded health care and benefits as a result of being human guinea pigs. During the 1960s and 70s, the United States military used a defoliant called Agent Orange that contains the deadly cancer-causing agent dioxin. This Agent Orange was sprayed on trees and shrubs in Vietnam in order to destroy all the foliage.
The debate went on for Agent Orange for years, that the Pentagon was saying no one was exposed to enough to cause any health problems. And we're in the same boat now with depleted uranium.
The amount of lies told by the U.S. government on this issue are so spectacular as to be mind-boggling.
Depleted uranium rounds have not only been spread all over Kuwait and southern Iraq, they have also been sprinkled all across Kosovo and Serbia, and are shot on a daily basis in such places as Vieques, Puerto Rico, and Okinawa, Japan, for training purposes and without any warning to the local populations.
And you wonder why Okinawa wants the Marines out of there. And by the way, I know personally because my wife grew up in Puerto Rico, Vieques, there is a massively high rate of cancer among the people there, especially the women. And Puerto Rican women have a history of being tested on. Go look what the Rockefellers did to them in the early 1900s. Just disgusting individuals, these scumbags, all of them. Disgusting filth, poor excuses for human beings. Humans are better than this. These people are like the lowest end of the stick. They are beneath dog shit. And they put themselves up as the high chancellors. Disgusting.
Today, 15 countries altogether possess and shoot ammunitions made of radioactive nuclear waste and are ready to sell them to whoever wants to buy them.
We don't have to litter the battlefield with something that's hazardous for 4.5 billion years. The world needs to ban the use of uranium munitions, period.
Many more laws and international safeguard regulations need to be enacted to prevent the recurrence of any such ordeal from the part of any government and against any population or country in the world.
And the worst part is, we did it again.
It's as much a crime to the Iraqi people as the invasion of Kuwait itself. Both are criminal. Both are responsible for the misery of this people, a country with resources, with very good history, with good civilization, with very advanced professional middle class. It's now all destroyed.
One of the things that we need within the United Nations is an oversight panel to make sure that UN Security Council resolutions do not themselves violate international law. What we have with the sanctions resolutions in Iraq is a decision, a resolution by the Council that violates the fundamental international laws as codified in the Geneva Conventions.
I have a better idea, lady. I have to disagree with you. Oversight, schmoversight, they're not going to do anything. Disband the UN.
That say that civilians cannot be targeted. Civilians cannot be targeted. And sanctions, if nothing else, target civilians. They are themselves a violation of international law. There needs to be an oversight method within the United Nations to make sure that that can never happen again.
Good luck with that. The UN they even back sanctions on Iran. There's only a minute or two left of the film. You guys can, I think there might be a full-length copy up on YouTube. Check it out. Try to find it on the internet if you can, and rip it before it disappears forever. It's one of those films that you just don't know when it's going to be up there. It's called Hidden Wars of Desert Storm. And I decided last night that I was going to, when I was sitting there prepping for today's show, I was laying things out, and I said, you know, what would be a good thing to cover? Because I wanted to, there's so much to go over, and I decided to go back and look at the first Gulf War again, as I said, because it's good to look at it. We have the ability right now, before we make this mistake again, okay, before we allow this mistake to be made again, we have the ability to let the people that are still asleep, the people that are still buying into this crap, we have the ability now to look back on things because there has been a precedent set. We can go back and say, look, this is what we were told, but this is the reality of the situation. And when you can compare the two, and look at the first Gulf War and then compare it to what we know about what we were told with Iraq, and the reality of what we know now, and now what we're being told about Iran, we're going to repeat history again, unless we pay attention to it. Well, how's that old saying go? Those that do not understand history are doomed to repeat it. Something to that effect. History was always my favorite class growing up when I was a kid in school. Although, of course, now you look back on it, you realize that most of it was skewered. But I liked history. Even at a young age, I realized that I could take lessons from history and use them in my present-day life and learn from them. And that's what I hope. That's what I tried to put forth tonight. It really is about sitting down sometimes and just listening. On this journey, you will continue to learn every day. I still do. That's probably one of my favorite parts about this, is that every day I learn at least one thing new. For real. Sometimes the listeners to radio shows have a tendency to put the host of the radio show up on a pedestal because we have anybody that does this, you have to have some sort of self-confidence to be able to go on air. So I guess sometimes it might come off as, some people do have egos, but sometimes it might come off as arrogance, whatever. But somehow hosts people who tell truth and stuff, because truth is, I guess, it really is a valuable commodity, should be just free-flowing. But because it's so hidden and people are lied to so much, when people tell truth, they're put up on a pedestal. And it's important for people to remember that people that do this, radio show hosts, researchers, we're all human just like everybody else, and we still learn too. And anybody out there that says that they don't learn is full of it. I learn something new every day. It's one of my favorite parts about this journey. Now, when I bring information to you, I do it on a level of, look, this is what I found out, check this out. I'm not trying to do it to be like, oh, look what I know, ha, 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 I'm cool. I do it because I hope that the stuff that I've uncovered can help wake you and others up. And then you can go spread that information. And eventually, once everybody starts doing the same thing, then the information will be free-flowing. So I try to just be the catalyst. And I hope tonight that I hit a nerve. I really do hope that somebody listening to this broadcast, even on rebroad, whatever, realizes that this is the same crap that's being spewed to us now. They want to put more and more sanctions on Iran, and then we bitch at Russia for helping them out and China for helping them out. Well, look what happened when nobody helped out Iraq. As I said when Dr. Dalia Wasfi was on, these sanctions destroyed the literacy rate of the people in Iraq. You heard it here again tonight. Dr. Wasfi said the same thing. Dalia said the exact same thing, that they were wiped out because the sanctions were probably worse than the initial invasion, the first battle we had. Learn from history or we're doomed to repeat it. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm out of time. I'll see you guys again Wednesday. Stephanie Sledge is going to be my guest, so tune in. Till then, I love you all. I'm out of here.